So you've gotten people to come to your house this Sunday for D&D. They've got their character sheets, you got your dice, you've got beverages, you've got snacks, you got a couple maybe memes you wanted to share with your friends. Ah shit, we should probably have a dungeon too. So today we're going to be doing a dungeon. We're going to be making a dungeon. We're not going to draw it out really because I want you to be able to do it yourself. But we're going to maybe discuss kind of how this goes. And maybe you can keep a list, maybe write this down, take notes, or you can just visit the video anytime you need references until you're comfortable with it. First thing, though, is Dungeons and Dragons doesn't necessarily have to take place in dungeons at all. I think my players have been in 2 dungeons, technically, like real dungeons. But I think any sort of dangerous, relatively closed-in area is a dungeon. Or at least it should operate like a dungeon. It doesn't necessarily have to be underground, you know, anything specific. It doesn't have to have goblins or skeletons. It could be literally anything. For instance, the last dungeon my players went on was all made of this paint that when you draw it, it creates a 3D shape. But it is made of paint, but say you drew maybe a piece of wood or a tree. Say you drew a tree with this paint, you painted a tree. It would look like a tree from far away. As you got closer, it would look like paint, but when you touched it, like you broke a piece off, it would feel like wood that looks like it was brushed on. So it wasn't necessarily a dungeon. And that's really the first question you have to ask yourself. What kind of dungeon do I want to make? And then we dive into the list I wrote down. Are you trying to make your dungeon for... Is this a side quest? Is this a main quest? Is this something that the characters need to pursue their goals, but also maybe there's cool shit down there? Is it only to serve one of the players, but everyone kind of went along with it? It's important to know the reason for the dungeon, because if you just place your characters in front of a dungeon for some reason, maybe they don't want to go in a dungeon. Always have some sort of carrot-stick situation. There should be something at either the end of the dungeon, some process through which completion of the dungeon benefits the character, something. Otherwise, they could easily just be like, nah, let's go to the city or the town or whatever and go to the bar there and wait for adventure or something. They could always do that anyways, but it's much less likely that they're going to abandon your plot hooks if they're good. So maybe we'll have a whole section on how to kind of not railroad your characters or your players, but also, you know, not let them just sandbox, because there's a difference. But for now, let's deal with you hooked them into going to a dungeon. So the first thing we have to decide is, what's the purpose of the dungeon? It could be an old church, maybe an old cave system. It could be a tower. Dungeons do not have to be subterranean. It could just be an old town, but it's a booby-trapped town filled with bandits, and so you treat it like a dungeon. There's many ways to kind of take the idea of a dungeon and tweak it to suit your needs, because a dungeon, in my view, isn't a subterranean place with undead things like a crypt. Like, basically every Skyrim dungeon is the same. They're either bandits, or it's some sort of undead, or there's some sort of arcane thing happening down there. That's almost all the Radiant quests in Skyrim, and that can be boring. Like, you can have it sometimes. It's certainly fun. There's no problem. In fact, it's thematically fine and fun to have a crypt where there's undead all over the place. It's kind of spooky, and it's expected. It's a trope for a reason. It's because it's a fun experience. But what is its purpose? It can be a tower. It can be, for instance, the first dungeon my players ever went to was in fact a tower. It was an old bank. It's called the Dust Vault, and dwarves used to live there, and now goblins have been using it since it's been abandoned for several hundred years. Goblins have been using it along with hobgoblins and bugbears to kind of grab people off the road and use them for rituals that my players did not discover, so I'm not going to talk about it here. And when they got to the top, they had a nice cool fight on top of a tower, and the bugbear had a mace that when he hit, it would push the other characters away, and that was a lot of fun. So it doesn't have to be anything, but it should be informed by where it is on your map. Is it in a jungle, a desert? Maybe it's in the Arctic. Maybe it's under the ground like usual. Maybe it's under a city. Maybe it's behind a bar, and inside that bar and in the back there's like a portal, and the characters walk through the portal, and suddenly they're in, I don't know, the Feywild, and there's shit happening there. So the first thing you have to consider when deciding what kind of dungeon it really is where is it? Would a dungeon in a jungle be underground? I think it would flood underground, right? It seems natural to think that it would flood underground. However, in my head I can see like Mayan or Aztec architecture, maybe a ziggurat in a jungle, and so you go in there and then it's all stone, and maybe it can start, maybe you start going down, and then when you get to the center you start going up, and you have to fight your way up to the top of this ziggurat that maybe is too tall to climb just normally. Unless you have a flying character, but, you know, maybe they have to go in for some reason to get to the top. The Yuan-Ti, for instance, in the Monsters Manual, they live in Egyptian or Aztec-y sort of stuff like that. So, yeah, that could be fun. Also, in a jungle, it could just be a sort of a jungle labyrinth. It's like a hedge maze, but jungle stuff. And so they have to fight through this jungle, much like you would I don't know, just a normal dungeon. It's just open to the sky. I think that's interesting. We have to consider what the materials are that make up this dungeon. If it's something standard, it's usually stone or marble or brick and stuff like that. But consider using non-conventional materials to make your dungeons. Like I said, the last dungeon I made was made out of this, it's called Marvelous Pigments, basically. It's paint that you can make things out of 3D objects, and they are semi-permanent. But wouldn't it be interesting to make something out of mirrors or glass, or maybe make something out of organic material? That could be creepy. And you could have that play in. For instance, if I'm thinking of an organic material to make it out of, the inside of the mouth of something, kind of like Empire Strikes Back when Han and Leia and Chewie and all, and the droids hide in the asteroid field, and then they're inside this giant space worm, and then they get out. That could be interesting. Or just a dead body of one of those things. That's always cool. So consider maybe a dead Tarrasque, and they have to climb into the Tarrasque, and maybe, I don't know, kobolds or something made a home of this place, which is just a body. Which automatically you have the layout of your entire dungeon, I guess, right? Just organs and bones and shit, so could be fun. Consider the condition and I guess the age of the dungeon that you're in. Is it an old dungeon? Dungeons always have this implicit sort of ancientness to them, but that doesn't have to be the case. A dungeon can be new. It doesn't have to be, like, who would, if you wanted a dungeon, like, I don't know, for instance, a mage has a hideout and it's a dungeon. Why would he use some old decrepit dungeon? And I mean, and he totally can. It could be for some arcane reason. Maybe there's a power source down there attached to the dungeon that's helping feed in whatever. But also, alternatively, the wizard could absolutely make his own brand new dungeon, so it doesn't always have to be this old, rickety, smelly, kind of damp. I mean, you get the idea where you hear the drip of water off in the distance and it kind of echoes through the halls, stuff like that. It doesn't always have to be exactly the same, so consider that. Who is in the dungeon? That's very important. Is it goblins, dwarves, maybe a painter? Like in my last dungeon, it was just a painter who liked to paint, and he was in the Feywild, and he was painting with his stuff, and the battle was really fun because it was dynamic. He had layer actions and stuff, which we'll go over when we talk about designing a boss battle. But it can be anybody, but it should make thematic sense. And it could also be super interesting. Take inspiration wherever you can get it, honestly. Say you're tired of the same old bandits over and over and over. Maybe they look like bandits, and then when you get in there, it's a bunch of changelings. And so suddenly you're faced with this very different encounter than you assumed. Or maybe it was two goblins standing on top of one another's shoulders, and they looked like humans, and instead you just go to a goblin horde. Anything is possible. Just consider kind of the flavor in your head. Why are they in there? What is their purpose? Why are the goblins pretending to be bandits? Is it because that normally their stature kind of makes people dismiss them? Is it because someone else is controlling the goblins and telling them what to do? Maybe it's just a dungeon filled with spiders, and when you get to the end, it turns out that maybe a Drider, which is a half drow, half spider, is in charge of those, or maybe an Ettercap if you're a lower level party. Never box yourself into the standard tropes, because it could be anything. You could put automatons down there, so you have a bunch of Warforged down there, and it turns out that this place is run by some sort of maniacal gnome, and he's been tinkering away for years and years to create an army. And you go in there before he's, he maybe has another decade to go before he can actually get an army, and you stumble upon him, and suddenly you preempt all of the bad shit that would have happened had he actually finished his Warforged army. Could be very interesting. Another thing to consider in your dungeon is traps. Are you going to use traps? And no, I don't mean the meme. I mean actual booby traps, like a spike pit, poison darts, whatever, blades. And what kind are they going to be? And are they going to be super deadly, or is it going to be more of a hindrance? And this kind of goes into a later thing we're going to talk about when we talk about balancing your dungeons. But do you want your traps to immediately kill your characters? If not, the way I would like to see people run dungeons, and specifically the traps. Like, you can totally have deadly traps that are just, this is the damage they always do. However, I like the idea of dynamic damage. So say you want to balance it to make sure that this trap doesn't kill your whole party, right? That's fine. So who do you balance that for? Do you balance it for the wizard, who has very low hit points? Maybe he has like 20 hit points around level 5, maybe 4. Because he rolled for them and he fucked up a couple of times. Who knows? But you also have a barbarian who's got close to 50 hit points. If the barbarian triggers the trap, it's barely going to hurt him. If the wizard triggers the trap, it could almost kill him, right? So what I would do is call dynamic damage die, which is something I just made up. Just act dynamically. Kind of, you should always have a sheet of like your player characters' ACs, their armor class, meaning how hard it is to hit them, their passive perception, which is kind of it's 10 plus their wisdom modifier to know what they would normally see, so you can know when to tell people like what stuff they noticed, or if someone's hiding and maybe they fail to roll, like a couple goblins are trying to hide and they roll a 6 or something, or maybe they roll an 11, and your barbarian doesn't notice them because his passive perception is a 9, but the wizard's is like a 14, so he notices them right away. And then also have their hit points, or at least a rough estimate of their hit points. You can usually decide what their hit points are, because every time they level up, they get a hit die, and the average hit die is about a D8 for most classes. And so just, if you want it to hurt them half, it should do 2d8 damage if they're level 4. Or if they're level 5, it should do 3d8. If it's more, just stick 2. But if it's the barbarian, roll d10s instead. Or d12s. Or if it's a wizard, roll d6s. Who knows? You can adjust it based on who triggers the trap, is basically the point. You don't have to set yourself into one thing, but you can. You can, because there can also be a system where maybe it's a brutal ass dungeon and it's going to do the damage it does. That's also fine. It just depends on what you want to do. I like to look at traps. It's not, okay, from a player's perspective, is it fun to die from a trap instantly? It feels kind of cheap, right? You want to die, if your character's going to die, you want them to die doing something heroic or brave, or you want it to be hilarious, or you want it to be in just this amazing battle. Like, if you die to Vecna, it doesn't feel like you got robbed, right? It's Vecna. But if you die to a pit trap, that's terrible. Now, what you can do, though, is use the traps that if they trigger them, they're weaker for their fight with whoever the boss is or the next group of enemies or whatever. Use it as a tax system. And this is kind of goes into balancing a little bit, but all encounters in a dungeon should be taking resources from the characters in preparation for their fight with that final thing. Because for player characters, struggle is kind of the essence of drama, and drama makes things feel dire, and when it feels dire and you overcome it, you feel like you were heroic. And that's what D&D fights should be. Heroic. Every time. Even if they're not actually heroes, even if they're all evil, it should still feel like at the end of a fight, at the end of a dungeon, it should feel like, holy shit, we overcame that. Now, not every time. Sometimes you can have an easy dungeon, that's fine too, but you can also have a hard one. Also consider, are there locked doors, maybe secret rooms, stuff like that, maybe locked chests that have goodies in them? If there are, consider different ways to pull this off instead of always having lockpicking, because it's always the rogue that's going to be doing this, really, right? Because they're the one with the thieves' tools. But if there are no thieves' tools, maybe you have a wizard with knock or something, but that's spell slots. So consider that, because if you do have a wizard, and you know that in your party, the wizard is the only one that really ever gets to try to unlock doors and chests and stuff, maybe make them consider how many slots they're using, and use it as a tax system. So maybe they will get a benefit from opening this door, which lets them into an armory, which gives a couple of them some different stuff, maybe some potions and whatever to make it a little bit easier. But they're wizard, and wizards are usually really, really important. He's down a slot because he had to open the door. So that's interesting. You always want to kind of weigh pros and cons with your decisions as a player, and I think a good dungeon makes you do that a lot. Also consider accessibility, like is the main enemy going to be behind a locked door? What if they can't open the door, right? So I usually have benefits and sometimes red herring benefits, like sometimes there'll be just another fight if they unlock a door, which is absolutely fine, or if they unlock a chest or whatever. But the main architecture, I guess, the main pathway from start to finish of the dungeon should never be interrupted by a door that either can't be broken or can't be lockpicked if they all fail their rolls. Like, it's not fun to just brute force it and roll over and over until you actually get it, but it is fun to maybe get an opportunity to unlock the door but no one can, and then they have to smash a door, but because of the way the door is, it will ruin whatever weapon is used on it. That's interesting. So, and it makes them consider what they're going to do. Maybe they have an extra weapon that they can just get rid of, but maybe bludgeoning damage is the only thing that really does the trick, and they only have like a mace and a hammer, and it's the two main weapons of two different characters, like the fighter and the barbarian. So maybe they have to decide, right? So it's interesting. Or they could come up with a different way and totally surprise you. In secret areas, this kind of goes with that, but sometimes there are maybe like secret doors and stuff. I would have... Make sure you leave clues for that kind of stuff, because it's not fun. I know I recommended Donjon before, and it's just a random dungeon generator. It randomly generates a lot of stuff, not just dungeons, but their dungeon generator is what they're known for. And sometimes it just has secret passageways that are just secret for no reason, which is fine. But as the DM, make the secret passages mean things, if that's going to be a thing. Maybe it circumvents actual like enemies that you would otherwise have to face that are kind of brutal or maybe hard, or maybe a trap room, maybe a puzzle, and reward your players for finding this sort of stuff. Also, it helps breed a little bit of paranoia in your players, which is always good in a dungeon. They should never feel safe, or at least not often. They can feel safe sometimes, but You want them to kind of always have to look at stuff, because sometimes they'll be rewarded and sometimes they'll be punished. Like, very rarely do I punish them for being overly curious, but who knows? Sometimes maybe you're curious and you're like, oh, I found like a block I can push on, and you push on the block and suddenly poison sprays in their eyes and that character is blinded for an hour and they have to go through this, but they can't short rest because there's enemies around, so they have to deal with that. And maybe they have to blow a healing spell, lesser restoration, or something to take care of that, and that's another tax you could do. Or maybe they just are going to deal with being blind, and that's also very interesting. Consider whether or not there's something unexpected. The information that the characters get doesn't always have to be 100% true. They could go to the barkeep, and the barkeep says, "Oh, there's a cave down there. It's got goblins in there, and they're taking their stuff." But really, maybe the bartender is getting paid by a group of bandits to tell people, you know, adventurers are typically more wealthy, tell adventurers to go down into this cave to get ambushed by bandits, and they're trying to steal their shit, and suddenly they're in this very crazy hectic fight. Maybe the door is slammed behind them and they have to find another way out of this maybe cave system or just bandit hideout, however it's structured. Maybe they have to, the door to this tower is slammed shut and they have to get to the top to get out, and maybe it's got set on fire, so there's a time limit. It could be literally anything. So consider unexpected events happening. I don't always do that, because then it just feels like, oh, this guy told us there was goblins. I bet there's a fucking there's just rust monsters in there instead. Or so, you know, sometimes consider giving bad intel. Maybe intel that didn't tell the whole story. So maybe there are goblins, but it turns out they also have a manticore as a pet down there. Maybe they go down there expecting a side quest. It turns out they actually have information that leads to a major plot hook. Maybe it has to do something with one of the player character's actual story arc. Who knows? It doesn't have to be just always side quests with dungeons or always go fetch the thing and get it. Maybe when they get down there, they find out one of the people in the dungeon who you thought was bad was actually good, and they've just accidentally killed a bunch of good guys. I mean, that's always, it could be interesting. You'd never know. And now mapping out your dungeon. I like to have one area in a long dungeon that I consider like a safe zone, if I know that the final fight is going to be challenging, because I don't always like feeling like the characters had to just brute force their way through a dungeon. It should feel like they have some strategy involved. Now, consider trade-offs though. Like if they have a safe room, maybe if it's a room with one entrance and they can bar the door shut, right? They want to take a short rest or maybe even a long rest to recharge fully. Maybe have a table ready, or maybe just have an idea in mind. If they do that, something in the dungeon will change. Maybe there'll be a respawn of enemies, although respawn is kind of rough. Maybe some open the front door and come in and shut the door behind them. Maybe there's a bunch of enemies waiting outside that door because they found out that that's where the adventurers were hiding. It totally could be, and it could lead to a little bit more interesting fight. But consider if it's a really long dungeon, don't rob your players of agency. Give them at least a few choices, basically. Also consider, when mapping out a dungeon, an escalation of the enemies in there. You can have mini-bosses. You can have just peons. Also consider using minions. Minions are fun. Maybe when they do open the door, there are about 15 goblins outside the door, and they're all waiting there for them. And maybe they hear scratching at the door. And when they wake up, and so they unbar the door, open it up, and then a flood of arrows comes through the hallway. Have them roll initiative. Roll the goblins in batches of like 5. So maybe there's 15. So you only have 3 initiative rolls. Have them all attack at the same time, but have them only have like 1 or 2 hit points. So if they do hit, you can say, okay, roll to hit. They hit. Roll damage, and then so say you got 6. You killed 3 of the goblins, right? That's fine. I think that's fun. You could say, okay, you quickly lose 3 arrows, kind of like Legolas, and take out 3 of the goblins on your turn. It makes the players feel like, I don't know, after about level 3, you're way stronger than a fucking goblin. You should, there's no reason to keep their AC and hit points the same. Now you can keep their damage the same. That's absolutely fine. They're to hit the same. But it could be an AC of 10, and it can be hit points of 1, 2, or 3, or something like that. And then that way, they can kill a bunch of goblins real quick. You can even lower the experience points. And it just kind of gives them this heroic feel that they really did some damage here. While mapping it out, consider how the place that you want this to take place would actually be mapped out. Maybe look up blueprints of, say, your dungeon is actually an old hospital, like a sanitarium or something. Look up maps online. There's tons of them. Look up like what they would have. You'd be surprised what you don't consider when you're just drawing a dungeon. Like, why is there bunk beds and a kitchen and a fireplace and stuff like this in your temple, but no bathrooms? Where are they going to shit, right? Is there just a pile of shit somewhere on the floor? Old ancient shit from all these dead clerics? But it could also just be a crypt, which isn't meant to live in, so why would it have some of these other things? So, you know, consider exactly where you're at and look up real-world blueprints if you want. Of course, D&D in general just has a huge community of people that make maps all the time. I'm sure you can find D&D maps of basically anything that you wanted to. Just make sure, kind of, the layout should have a reason behind it. And you can have dead ends, but consider why those dead ends are there. So maybe if you are in a crypt, maybe there's a dead end. When they get to the end, it seems like an unfinished tunnel, like the brick isn't done being laid, and in front of you is like actually earth and stuff. It's been there for a while, but you can tell that it wasn't actually walled off. That's interesting. That's good design. Now is when we talk about balance. What you want, again, a dungeon should be a fight against attrition. It's basically your players have a finite amount of resources, be it their spells, their hit points, maybe ammunition if you have people with arrows, if you like to track that. I do like to track that. Just depends on where they're at. Like if they go through a city a lot, we'll just assume you bought some arrows which are cheap. That's fine. Or maybe you made some. Consider things like food and water depending on how long they're going to be in the dungeon. It could take several days. Maybe they'll have to find food and water. Maybe they won't be able to sleep. So exhaustion could be part of the taxation. Always consider, like, each room, what is the potential cost to the players. Now they could just totally wipe it out, and that's good for them, but they could, maybe in room A when they fight, you know, they spent the night and they've rested up, so they're back to full, but and then those 15 goblins come out. Maybe one of them gets hit pretty hard. Maybe one of them gets hit with 5 arrows. It could totally happen. So consider that, you know, their successes and failures in each room. Of course, there's always the option that they could just totally mess up and die. But I don't like to kill my players on purpose. I like them to make mistakes, and if they're going to die, it's their fault. I don't want them to feel robbed. I want them to feel like they could have made decisions that were different, that would have, you know, kept them alive. Except unless we're talking about super intelligent boss fights, in which case I am always trying to kill them, and they just beat me anyway. Because of the nature, I guess, of D&D is you want to try to balance each fight in a different way. So, are the goblins meant to kill the players? Probably not. The goblins are meant to, you know, take some time, be fun, of course. You want it to be fun. You definitely want it to add flavor. You definitely want the characters to feel like heroes. That's what goblins are for. Goblins and skeletons and bandits, you know, those are cannon fodder. Those are bodies that the players get to put notches on their belt with. That's really what they're for. But consider maybe there's a goblin with a hobgoblin captain in charge of them. So now it becomes minions, 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 and also there's a mini boss, right? So they fight through these hordes of goblins, and now there's maybe 2 goblins that have their normal stats, like they have, you know, I think it's like 13 hit points and a 12 AC or something like that. And then 1 hobgoblin, so it's like his lieutenants, the goblins that can stand up to you, and a hobgoblin. So it's not probably going to kill any of your characters, but again, it's going to tax them. You're going to have to blow probably a spell, because there's 3 of them. One person might need healing, maybe Fireball can just take them all out at once. You know, it just depends on what you got going on. And also, you're probably going to lose a few hit points from this. The Hobgoblin Captain is probably going to hurt whoever's tanking it, probably the fighter or the barbarian, whatever you got going on, maybe a cleric and your paladin, some heavy hitter. And then maybe the goblins, and consider their tactics as well. What are goblins going to do? At first, goblins are just going to attack whatever they see, most likely. But maybe these 2 goblins, because they're lieutenants, know that, like, don't try to hit the most heavily armored character. Aim for the wizard or the bard or whatever you got in the back that doesn't have heavy armor. And maybe the hobgoblin can even say that out loud in the fight to let your players know that you know that you're using tactics, and they know it too. And so the hobgoblin can kind of, you know, do that. Now, consider maybe you don't always need a boss fight. It's not important that you always have a boss in each thing. And I say boss fight because it's most akin to video games. But if you are going to do a boss fight, why is this person the boss? Are they the boss because they're the most powerful? Are they the most intelligent? Maybe they're just the oldest. Maybe they're well respected within the group. So consider why they're the boss. Consider when you're making the dungeon why this boss would have chosen this place in the first place. So, in my last dungeon that we did, it was in the Feywild, and they had a painter who was painting things, and he was actually just there to paint. It was basically, he made this place, and it seems like there was booby-trapped on the way to keep people out, because he certainly didn't like visitors, but also he wanted just a safe place to kind of paint and do his art and not be disturbed. And so the last little bit has a greenhouse, probably where he got his food from, has, you know, little underlings where, so he has some company, but also some protection and probably people to go out and fetch him like different paints or different, you know, stuff that he might need in the rest of the world. But this last room had 6 paintings on the walls, so the paintings were magically imbued, and so he had 1 legendary action each round that I could use basically whenever I wanted. And so sometimes he would roll on the paintings table, and it would have an effect. Basically, the person nearest to that painting would experience the effect, whatever it was, be it fear or teleportation, or maybe they could be disarmed or whatever, and they had to make a save against it, and if they didn't, the effect would take place. But also, he had spell casting, so he could always do a spell, and he had one more thing that he could do, which is a 5/6 recharge, which is basically you take a d6, and if you roll it to see if the ability is recharged, although when you start the fight, it does exist, kind of like a Dragonborn's breath weapon. You roll, if you say you use the breath weapon, or you use his paintbrush, which is what this was, and you, at the beginning of your turn comes back around, and now it's your turn again, turn number 2. You roll a d6. If it lands on a 5 or a 6, you get that ability back. It's a recharge. It's not just something like a, you know, you take a long rest. It can happen, but it just takes a little bit to recharge. So every time he got that, he got to paint something. I made a table of different animals and beasts and stuff like that, about 10 of them. And I had the players... as it happened, I just picked one at random and then went clockwise. They got to roll a d10 and basically decide what he paints on accident. So the first thing he painted was a Yeti. So now he's just got this painted Yeti on his team, which is interesting because now you have to deal with the Yeti, you have to deal with the spell casting of the painter, you have to deal with the painting, which is actually, you know, it's a meat shield. It basically takes hit points for him. And then you have the actual paintings in the room that, you know, cause all this chaos, basically. And it was a really, really fun fight. I think it was super interesting. Also, in my tower one, I told you there was a bugbear at the top. Bugbears are basically super hulky, hobgoblin-y sort of people. They're semi-intelligent, you know, not super bright. They're hulky, sort of just slobber knockers. And so I put them on top of a tower and gave him a mace, and then I just gave him the ability to push players 10 feet anytime he hit them. And so we're on this tiny platform on top, and so he could push people off the top of the tower, which made someone like the bard in our party, or the wizard in yours, or whoever is basically not your beefiest character, it forced them to consider where they were standing, like, oh, I should get closer to this thing, because if it comes over to me and hits me, yeah, it'll hurt, but falling off this tower is going to hurt a lot more. So play with positioning. Also play with, consider more layer actions, or just terrain differences. So they did go to some other crypts, and at the end was a rather weak vampire spawn, but on the ground, and it's something they had done before. There was a trap earlier in the dungeon where the floor was made of red tiles, and if they were to step on them, they would take fire damage, but they found these little red gemstones, and then they were able to just walk on them. Well, the red gemstones didn't work in the other room, and I made sure they noticed it, because they were holding it, and I mentioned to them, it seems like because there were 2 towers on either side. There was basically like columns that were made of the same red stone. When the people holding those stones were next to them, it didn't seem to have any effect. So I rolled separate initiative for the 2 towers, and when those towers, they would take 2 turns to charge up, they would explode, making every tile on the ground turn red, causing fire damage. However, I also had 2 sets of stairs and a platform, and the platform was unaffected, but it was closer to where the vampire was. So they had to get up and close as to not take fire damage just automatically, or they could be back down here away from the vampire and more safe unless they wanted to get hit by the fire thing. So consider these things when you're doing it to make it a little bit more dynamic, instead of just like, he stands there and just slaps at them, and then they stand there and slap back. No, it should have more moving parts, I think, and that's a little bit more work for you, but I guarantee it's more fun, because in boss fights, I tend to pit me against the players. Now, I am going to lose this probably every time, but maybe someday I'll beat them all, and that would be great. But as long as they don't feel cheated out of the experience. And what happens if they find a cave and you were going to stop the session, but they got there way fast? They blew through everything, and now you have this crypt, this dungeon that you've promised them content for, but you don't know how. You can wing it. You can absolutely wing it. Just go room by room, draw it out one at a time, and if you need time to think about something, put some enemies in the next room and have that fight happen while you're thinking about stuff. Use your phone to Google stuff. You can go to Donjon, and they can build you a very quick dungeon if you'd like, and just kind of always have, in your free time, have some encounters. I have a little black notebook around here, it's downstairs. I have that filled with different encounters and of just ideas that I think, like, oh, for levels, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, because these are the levels that we're at right now. What are some fun enemies that you could fight, and where do they live? If they happen upon something that you didn't have planned content for that particular session, you might have to tap into that. So just have that kind of stuff prepared just in the background. And to finish off this video, I got some other dungeon-related questions I got from Twitter and Discord. One of the questions was, how do you keep dungeons from being repetitive? Because that is a danger of dungeons. They can be very repetitive. It's always like, go in, grab a sword, leave, kill the enemies. Okay, but it doesn't always have to be that. We talked about it a little bit before, like making the locations different, making maybe the final battle or a couple of the battles inside of it more dynamic and interesting. But I think let yourself be inspired by other media. You could see, like, maybe you see a sci-fi movie or a horror movie. So say, for instance, a little bit of both. Say Alien, for instance. Maybe you have a whole thing that is basically the plot of Alien. Like, maybe there's some people trapped in this something. It could be a dungeon, doesn't have to be. Maybe a building. But there's a monster hunting them. Maybe it's an Oni or something. If you know anything about the Oni in the monster manual, it's like a boogeyman of sorts. Or maybe it's just an actual beast monster thing. They have xenomorphs. They have stat blocks for xenomorphs online that I guarantee you can find. Although I wouldn't physically have it be a xenomorph personally, but onkegs are fun. But it should be something scary, I think. I think you can do that. So just take ideas from other things that you like. Maybe you have a really fun memory of a certain comic book, or I don't know, the movie Labyrinth or Lord of the Rings or anything. And we already kind of talked about this, how to make sure to get your characters to actually go into dungeons. I will probably have an episode about how to hook players and making sure. But again, just a carrot stick situation. Make sure there's a reason. Also, and I discussed this before, probably on stream, but it deserves a mention in a video. You should have had a discussion, or you should have a discussion if you haven't already, with your players. There's sort of this agreement when you sit down and play Dungeons and Dragons. Everyone should try to say yes to things. Now, they don't always have to, but if they're given the opportunity to adventure, they ought to say yes. Now, they don't have to, and make sure you tell them they don't have to. There is this implicit sort of urge to adventure when you're playing an adventurer in Dungeons and Dragons. So, as a player, when your DM gives you an obvious plot hook, take the bait. You know, it could lead to somewhere really fun, because odds are your DM worked pretty hard on this, and it was something that they made so that you could have fun. And you should probably do it. Now, again, you don't have to. Maybe there's two options. Maybe this dungeon or whatever exists just statically on the map, and maybe as the DM, you're like, yeah, you could go to this now, or you don't have to. It's fun. It's on your way, but you could hit it when you come back. I've literally done that before, and they ended up going there the session after. So it's absolutely fine if you don't want to. But just know that, like, if your DM gives you plot hooks, this isn't a video game. It's not, and procedural generation is only as vast as the preparation the DM has already. That's probably what they had planned for you for that session. So you probably will have a better time if you just take the hooks. Now, it could also be that your DM is offering you this so that you will waste time doing that thing instead of going towards whatever goal you were going to otherwise, which is also good DMing. So consider that as well. And especially if you're a DM, consider the scale of time always. And we'll probably have a whole episode dedicated to time passage in your games and the importance of that, and having a calendar of events that happen with or without your player's intervention. But that's it for dungeons. We're not actually drawing out a dungeon today because I don't want to kind of make you a dungeon. I want you to be able to kind of take in the Bob Ross approach here and just let it do whatever you want it to do. This is your world. You can make it whatever you want. Don't let me tell you how to do it yourself. Just beat the devil out of it.
You know, this is the fun part of this whole technique. We wash our brushes with odorless thinner, shake them off, and just beat the devil out of them.
So yeah, maybe we'll do a map together. We did do a dungeon the other day on stream that I did use and was very fun. If you were one of those members of the stream, you will notice that I mentioned it today in this video. So yeah, if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up, give it a share, give me a subscribe. Oh, that really gets me going, let me tell you. If you subscribe, oh boy, I just tent in the pants. And leave a comment down below if you have any more tips for other DMs or players for dungeons. If you have any questions, definitely ask them down in the description, and I'll try to get to them. Other than that, I guess happy dungeoning, and enjoy Dungeons & Dragons. I love you very much. I'm Jake.